Right. Well, hi everyone. Maybe we can actually give a little bit more time. And it's so online start coming in only at that time. But perhaps for the ones in the room, to maybe do a little round of who's in the room. Any of the charter signatories in the room? Yeah, one, two, excellent. IRC, yes, we have exactly. Anyone from private sector? Oh, yes, okay, maybe you want to introduce.
I'm from transport logistics, so I'm just here to learn.
That's what we're always trying to do, learn. Excellent. Anyone from philanthropies or consultancies or, yeah?
Working with lots of different foundations actually, and hopefully with Nishani as later, helping to colour cards for social ventures, but also background in humanitarian, so mercy communities.
Exactly. Thanks. Anyone else from consultancy? Academia? Yeah. We'll have more there. Yes, academia. We have a few students here as well, I think. Yeah, excellent. Thanks. So just to kind of feel the room so we know who's here. And what about you?
You mentioned NGOs. Did you mention NGOs?
I mentioned charter. You're right. Let's say non-charter signatories. Any NGO, civil society? Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Cecil Haferkamp. I work for a partnership called Community-Led Forest Economies, fairly new, launched at COP30, combining bioeconomy with IPLC and kind of a power shift agenda. In a previous life, I worked for the Harvard program on humanitarian policy and conflict research, so this is kind of very previous life, but still.
Well, our previous lives come in handy, I think. And you?
I'm Caetano. I'm from Brazil. I've worked with the Plan Amazon network.
Excellent, amazing. So we've got an interesting room today, and we've also got a. Where are you from? We're going to put you on the spot there, are we? Well, lovely to have you here. Are we?
I'm going to start with people like that.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be good. Let me just get my water bottle. And we've got, for those in the room, we've placed some bottles of water around and on the floor as well. They might be behind you if you can't.
Or our heads.
Yes. So just to keep yourself hydrated. And yeah, if we are letting people in, we are excellent. Hi everyone. For those who are joining online, welcome. We're going to give a little bit. We're on time, so we may be.
Hello, dear. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Playa.
Okay, so maybe just to quickly kickstart introductions. My name is Nishani Jayamaha. I am a co-coordinator of. It's going to be a long name. The Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. We're a secretariat of 2 people. My co-coordinator, Natasha, is based in New York, so I'm not sure if she's going to be able to manage to join so early. But I'm based in Geneva normally. Very happy to be here at the London Climate Action Week and bring together a panel of experience, lessons learned and sharing, which is what we want to bring to this table in a way to kind of look at how actually locally led communities are really looking at advancing climate and environment action, especially in humanitarian context, and how financing these communities more directly is really how useful this is to really support them in their resilience building for in terms of facing climate impacts, but also the convergences of climate and conflict. So you'll hear more, and also in other areas where there's heat. We talk about heat. We have here who is here who will be having some experiences from extreme heat and what they're doing. And then to maybe give a little update on, for those who don't know the Charter Secretariat or the Climate and Environment Charter, we were launched in May 2021 as a part of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. who were looking at how we're responding in the context of humanitarian action, but we were not taking into account climate and environmental action into this. So really trying to bring in how do we mainstream integrate climate and environment action in humanitarian context, especially in conflict, fragility, post disasters, post conflict context, protracted crises. The most difficult areas to work, but are also the highest impact of climate change that we are seeing in the most vulnerable communities. So then the Charter Secretariat was established 2 years ago. So we have 2 big years, 5 years of the Charter being launched and 2 years of the Secretariat. We have over 530 signatories to the Charter right now. It's quite an interesting range between national, local, regional organizations. 60% are actually national and regional based. And also at the same time, we have the cross-sector societies, UN agencies, academia, think tanks, and some of you are here and panelists are also part of the community. And we work with partners to bring in expertise, share lessons learned, do this sort of events, do advocacy, but also one-on-one support to humanitarian organizations to be climate smart and environmentally sustainable in the programs we're doing, in the work we are doing, and in our operation. That's a quick overview. But without further ado, I would love to hand over and thank sincerely the London School of Economics. And I'd like to hand over to Stuart Gordon.
Thanks very much. First of all, I apologise for turning up in safari shorts. I've literally just got back from safari. So, there we go. I'm a professor in the Department of International Development here at the LSE. I also direct the humanitarian programme, and I'm one of the co-directors of the humanitarian research group as well. Even though the event today is organised by the Climate Environment Charter Secretariat and the DEC, we're absolutely delighted to be able to host today's event. The topic could hardly be more timely. Humanitarian organisations, as we all know, are confronting a perfect storm of rising climate risks, increasing climate and environmental pressures, growing displacement, and of course, courtesy of the Orange Man in the United States, shrinking resources as well. At the same time, there's a growing recognition that many of the most effective solutions are locally led and community owned. Yet one of the biggest challenges remains how we finance those efforts, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected settings where traditional funding mechanisms often struggle to reach the people and the communities most exposed to risk. What makes today's discussion especially interesting for me is that it moves beyond the really familiar question of how much money is available and asks a much more important question: what kinds of financing mechanisms are most effective in enabling communities to anticipate, adapt, and build resilience in the face of climate and environmental shocks? We've obviously got an outstanding panel here today, bringing experience from across humanitarian action, disaster risk reduction, insurance, education, microfinance, community resilience, and grade 7. Is it grade 7?
Yeah, right.
Wow, I'm good. I'm sure we'll hear not only about innovative approaches, but also about the practical challenges of scaling them and ensuring that they remain genuinely local led. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, whether you're in the room or whether you're online. I hope you enjoy what promises to be an absolutely fascinating discussion. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Nishani from the Charter Secretariat, who is the boss.
Thank you so much. Thanks. You covered quite a lot of the important pieces of why we're doing this session, really. And I don't think we need to go into that again. But one of the things I think we'd like to highlight is that the Charter Secretariat's been kind of gathering and convening these sort of discussions because of the challenge that obviously funding is posing to the sector, especially the humanitarian sector. It's seen funding crisis. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of action happening on the ground and a lot of local action. And this is what we wanted to highlight in many parts of the world, how organizations, humanitarian organizations, even with the funding crisis, are trying to actually make things work. And how can we then look at scaling this up, hence the scaling piece of this particular session, and how can this be scaled up in a systematic, sustainable manner? That is one of the things that we really need to look at. How can this be more sustainable to ensure that we're really supporting the communities who are asking us for this sort of support in humanitarian context where there's no development actors most of the time, there's no climate environmental action happening, there's no climate financing going to these countries. I think of most of many of the countries in conflict and fragility, there's only Somalia maybe that might have got climate financing so far, and that's also not enough to really manage this sort of the amount of support required, the adaptation required, the mitigation required to really move things forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel today. And I'm going to start with Murtaza, who's online. Thanks, Murtaza, for joining us online. Can you hear us?
Thank you. Good afternoon to all participants and our stakeholders, and thank you very much to take me opportunity on the discussion on the this panels. I am Murtaza from Pakistan. So, I am the CEO of RCDP, Rural Community Development Programs. This is the MFIs, a microfinance company based in Pakistan. Uh, the initiative was natural from a critical gap was observed in the rural areas. I am introducing to me that our organization and our company based in Punjab, and we have 250 branches and across the Punjabs with 2,700 staff members. This is only my introductions. And our initiative, especially in the climate change, we have the PMER unit, Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Research unit. So they have already research work in the rural areas, especially those areas to affect by the climate change, disaster, and others things, because our community is very illiterate, especially in the females, because they have no access in the banking and financing, and they have the need the financing for their livelihood and uplifting their financial positions. Our operation areas, especially in 64% of operation areas in rural areas or specific agriculture and livestock, remaining 36% our operation in urban and semi-urban areas. RCDP institutions journey, if you thinks about RCDP established in 2015 as a spin-off from RCDS, established in 1995 as an NGO, Integrated Development Organization, due to regulatory change in Pakistan that required microfinance operation to separate from development work. That is why to reach maximum unbanked communities in the Pakistan, RCDP was registered as a company in 2015 as not for profit. Then in 2016 got non-banking microfinance company license to provide the financial services across the Pakistan. If you think about currently RCDP has expanded to 250 branches across the Punjab, and with 2,700 people, cumulative disbursement. If you see, we have reached USD 432 million dollars within 2 million household, especially in the rural areas. And our current active portfolio stand at US USD 72 millions within the 400,000 active client in this time. The scale of this operation is rooted in 30 years legacy of rural transformations, celebrated at our recent Silver Jubilee within nearly 2,500 attendance, in testament to trust we have built in the communities we serve. And we have the footprint in other provinces. I mean, in Sindh, Kepeki, and Gilgit-Baltistan, we have the operations. This is a little bit my introduction here.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Zak. I hope you can hear us from the room. Can you?
Sorry?
You can hear us?
Yes, Chef.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for sharing a little bit of how RCDP was formed. It's interesting to hear that RCDP was actually an NGO, and because of the regulatory changes in Pakistan, that they actually had to shift to become a company in order to do this microfinancing work that they're doing, that you will hear a little bit more later on. And I'd like to introduce next in our panel, there's no particular order. I'd like to introduce, we've got Caroline Birch, Head of Impact from Humanitarian, from that corner. And she'll be looking at and sharing with you a little bit more on parametric insurance in climate risk, in conflict fragile and humanitarian settings, with some examples from interesting contexts. Thanks, Caroline. And then we've got Emma Gremley, who is the Senior Director of Education, Economic Recovery and Development. Quite a lot of things. Yeah. And she's with the International Rescue Committee, IRC. Thanks for being here. And you'll be focusing on the Climate Resilient Education Systems Trial, CREST, right? So it's a slightly different. We're looking at some of the parametric changes, but this is looking at an education angle. So we're going to have some different examples coming here. And then we've got Mihir Bhatt, who is the Director of All India Disaster Mitigation Institute. It's also one of our board members of the Charter Secretariat. So we're really happy to have you on board here in person. We don't get to often see you in person. So he will be looking at the work that they're doing in India, and it's called the Small Businesses, Small Towns, Small Adaptation, Big Resilience Project, right? And it's looking at extreme heat. So maybe London and the UK can learn quite a lot from what they're doing in India, even here.
I haven't got the heat.
Okay, are you sure? Anyway, so without further ado, I think I would like to maybe kickstart on a bit of an introduction. We already heard from Murtaza a while ago, but one of the questions I think I really want to find out is, give us a little bit of an example of what, hear from you, what your initiatives are and why you kind of started this initiative, and kind of following on from what's happening in Pakistan with the work at the microfinancing work that they're doing. I'd like again to go to something local. So maybe hear from you a little bit here. What is this project that you're working on in India? Over to you.
I work with All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, and it's an action learning institute. So we do things that we with the policy out. Vice versa, what's happening at global level, you try to implement. One of the gaps that we saw where we thought action research was needed and there was a demand coming from the local users communities was to work with small businesses. There's very good work being done with informal sector workers, and that needs to be continued and supported. Very good work being done on people like large citizens, insurance companies, but small business, not so much. And they are economically active. In India, they have far more contribution from the local markets, local economy. If you want to change the economy, they actually change that far rapidly than large corporations. So we thought that is something which needed some closer observation, attention. Second thing, a lot of work is either in rural areas, insurance-related work. When it is affected populations. It's large metropolis when the insurance companies cover, but small towns get left out. And in India, it's very important to have small towns. That was second. And third was sort of adaptation mitigation projects. They have to be large, kind of huge, and then only they start implementing. And there is no reason to do that. So we thought, how small can it be? And maybe, as small as a small businesses. So that was the thinking that was behind. This was after the COP, where loss and damage fund was set up. We thought we will do something on the line, and we were part of the delegation there with the charter. And then we saw how this global loss and then other things, how excruciatingly reinvent things which are already known forever. And we just didn't want to put in more effort and time there. We went directly to the affected small businesses and asked them what could be done. And one of the things they said was that we actually have some money to do something because we are doing something for you before you came. So maybe we explain that to you, and they explained. And second, they also said that let's start doing something concrete, then make a large project for the next 6 months, 9 months, 2 years, and then do that. So we put together an idea where that was basically what you would call cash transfer to start with, and where they would use a small amount of cash initially generated by them as a surplus, subsequently capitalized with that to take the most important action that they thought would be would make tremendous difference in terms of their health, and second, tremendous difference in terms of their life. And that's something what we've been doing for the last 3 years. Last year they came up again and said that it would be important to see that the measures that we are taking are actually protected from other risks that come. And this insurance, and so the idea of the parametric insurance came up. Quite a few experiments going on, and we hear about that subsequently. In India, there were large experiments being done, so we picked that up. And two results, and I will stop. One is that for last 3 years, we are set up for 10 years. Let's see what we have. But 3 things we found. One, tremendous ingenuity on each of the 1,000 small businesses around 11 cities. So tremendous ingenuity in how they manage the finance to reduce risk. So this idea that you need great econometrics or anything else is useful at a practical level, but when it is at a practical level, people are actually doing it with tremendous ingenuity. And it's not what I'm saying. We had somebody from the Harvard Business School come and look at it, and they said it's an impressive risk management finance portfolio, almost each of them. So that's one point. Second, because of this, the impact on the livelihood loss has come down during summer, has come down from extreme heat from 18-19% to 7-8%. So there is a tremendous going down possible in 2 or 3 years' time. You don't really need. And third, and that's the last, is on the health impact. That is actual money paid from their pocket for buying medicine, doctor, or to the hospital. That has come down again from 23% 2 years to 8, 9, 10%. So a very small amount of money left to the affected population, in this case, extremely affected population of small businesses in small towns, can make tremendous in their lives. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really very useful insights into how already local action is happening, as you mentioned, and it's there doesn't need to be a huge investment to actually have big gains, right? And that's what we're seeing at local level. We always talk about the big insurance, but it's there's a lot going on already where small inputs can have big outputs, is what I'm gathering from your initiative. And maybe I'd like to go to you, Caroline, to hear a little bit about the work you're doing with Humanity Insured, with NGOs, civil society, UN agencies around the world, because it's also parametric insurance, and kind of to hear about what that kind of model looks like and what you're working. Just to kickstart to hear what it's about, what your initiatives are.
Lovely. Thanks, Nishani. I think that was a very good segue, actually, because when you said you just need a little bit to start off the big results. So Humanitarian Insured was set up about a year and a half, nearly 2 years ago. What we do is we're privately funded, so funded by the insurance industry, by corporates and by philanthropists. We don't get any government funding. That's important because what we're trying to do is to mobilize private. One of the questions people are always asking, and I think you mentioned also, Nishani, for today, is where's the private sector in all of this? We've heard about the orange man. I apologise for my choice of trousers today. It wasn't deliberate, not a sign of support. But on a serious note, there is a lot of money out there. And with a very little in terms of an insurance premium, benefits are potentially absolutely huge. So what we do is we subsidise the insurance premium for parametric insurance. Is everyone familiar with parametric insurance? So you know indemnity insurance, if you have to insure your car or something, you crash it, say you damage your car, someone will want photos, someone will try and persuade you that actually it's not that badly damaged and you don't need the whole amount of money that you've been paying for 10 years. I go on a little bit. The point being, indemnity insurance takes forever. It doesn't necessarily pay. You don't know how much it will pay, if it pays. You don't know when it will pay. It's all a bit of a drama. The thing about parametric insurance is that no opinion is involved. So if we take, for example, what Mihir was talking about, extreme heat in India, we have various projects in India. The idea is as soon as it hits 41 degrees, no one can dispute the fact that it is 41 degrees. The thermometer says so. That's when you get the payment. If you have, for example, a cyclone is barreling towards the Philippines and it reaches 110 miles an hour at 49 miles off the coast, that's when you get the payment.
And so this is set already?
This is set. You've agreed in advance that the wind speed is 110 kilometres or miles, whatever I just said. I'm slightly making it up. And then within a radius of 50 miles off the coast. And the beauty of a cyclone is, I don't speak as an insurance person because I'm not one, the beauty is it can hit that wind speed at 49 miles off the coast. There's your payment. If the cyclone, then, whatever scientific reason, decides to turn around and go back out to sea, nobody got hurt. Nothing got even blown away. But you've got the payment because that was what was agreed when you set off and when you bought that insurance policy. That's the huge difference between kind of insurance that we're talking about. Indemnity for climate change is a whole different thing. We don't really deal with that. I don't think it's as well adapted and such like. I think because I come from the humanitarian sector, spent my career at various organisations. And do you remember not so long ago actually, we used to say, oh, why cash? Why are we giving cash? And then suddenly everyone was feeling a bit stupid and sort of said, well, why not cash? This is the way ahead. So my question today would be, you sort of think, oh, I hope you sort of think, well, that sounds quite exciting, this idea of parametric insurance. I don't believe in indemnity, that sounds awful, but parametric sounds quite fun. And I very much hope that we're at that tipping point now where people don't keep saying, oh, do you think insurance might help? Where it's more this idea of, why am I not using prearranged finance? Why would you not, if you think about it, and with apologies to Ed, we've had the conversation, so it's fine and it won't get hostile, but why on earth, if you know that these terrible things are happening, there are heat waves in India, or wherever it might be, there are cyclones coming and hitting, there's a huge 1 in 50-year drought in Syria. Why on earth would you wait for that drought to hit, for the cyclone to hit, for the women to be collapsing, headloaders to be collapsing in the streets? Why would you wait for that to happen when you can have a pre-agreed amount of money in your bank account within days?
Right. Thanks. And that kind of goes into being prepared. That's that preparedness element, the anticipatory action element that needs to be put in place before people are already facing the losses and damage. I mean, you were talking about the loss and damage fund. It takes time. It comes to governments. It's not accessible to local communities. So how are we trying to actually be able to have local communities and communities be able to access this funding so that they can prepare themselves? And even if it didn't hit, it's fine. They're actually well off because now they're even more prepared for a next round, and they're not having to be like, oh, should we be losing something? And we'll hear more about what happens when loss happens, but at least they have some kind of setup going on which supports them to be resilient and for the future. And perhaps I'd like to go to you now, Emma. Could you explain a little bit about the CREST and what you're working on and why it is that you guys started this?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe if I just take a step back for a second. You said my very long title, Michelle, but basically I head up IRC's Global Education and Economic Development Programmes, and I'm based out of Nairobi with a global remit. Nairobi being about 10 degrees cooler than in London at the moment, so this is a bit of a shock. But just while we're talking about education in this space, so globally we're looking about 258 million children affected by crisis or living in crisis-affected places at the moment. 93 million of those children are out of school, and about 40 million children a year are affected by climate events. But that doesn't even account for the overlapping and compounded crises of conflict and heat events, particularly happening at the same time. Based in Nairobi, I've seen a lot of disaster risk finance, which is what parametric insurance is part of, or pre-arranged finance, initiatives that look particularly at food security, at agriculture, at social protection, but none of them were looking at education and what happens to children's education, children's learning when a climate event happens. So we thought with the CREST programme, which is an initiative that is NSPO funded and takes place in 2 counties in Kenya, can we look at ways in which we can use parametric insurance, which Caroline explained, and to try and mitigate the effects of drought and now flood in Kenya, in these 2 climate-affected districts. And because we're talking about locally led actions in this session, one of the things that was really important was that community engagement. So we started out by looking at what communities currently do in the face of drought or floods, and to respond to that, what happens at school level, what parents do, what families, what actions they take. And we found from that what families most wanted was, as we've also spoken about, to absorb the economic shock, but also ways for children to continue learning. And that shaped the design of CREST. What happens in CREST, we have a parametric insurance policy with ARC Limited, which is a regional risk pool that covers Africa. It supports sovereign-level insurance, governments themselves, but also international agencies to buy similar insurance so that you can have a more comprehensive approach. When a certain trigger is hit, and in our case, it's rainfall and vegetation index, we have 2 triggers for our drought insurance, we release a cash payout to families. And that cash is to mitigate the loss of school meals that children might have had at school, but also recognizing, particularly in a drought situation, families might be on the move with livestock, etc., to look for better pasture. And so the kids will be out of school. So it's an unconditional cash transfer, but it's also a way to keep in touch with the families. What we found during COVID is that many children disappeared from school and we didn't have ways to contact them again to bring them back to school. And this helps us keep in touch with families. And then we also delivered remote education through SMS, IVR, and phone calls directly to students' families. And the idea was to try and keep children safe and well during a climate event and make sure that they return to school afterwards. We had a payout during the 2025 drought response. We had a payout of around $650,000. That supported over 8,500 families with cash responses and made education available to around 50,000 students remotely. But this isn't really about how we bring insurance into education. It's about how we look at new financing tools, of which insurance is one, but it's part of a broader suite of responses around pre-arranged finance. to make sure that we can support children and communities and families to stay engaged with school, recognising the protective factors that school brings, but also recognising that every time children are removed from school, even if it's only temporarily, their chances of completing education and therefore going on to live healthy, productive lives are significantly diminished. And so what we're trying to cope with is trying to experiment with is using innovative finance in a way that can try and smooth out those interruptions to children's education and make education systems more shock responsive in a way that they need to be, catch up with those other sectors that are more proficient users of this type of finance.
Yeah, quite unusual in the education sector to hear of parametric insurance or insurance too, right? I mean,
the challenge is getting education people to talk to finance people. There's a big divide between the language that we use. There's a bit of translation needed.
Absolutely, I can see this in different sectors that we're not talking to each other about how this sort of financing can be useful for even their niche sectors, which we haven't thought about, like education would have been on the top of our head, or not my head anyway. But maybe I think in a way, once you're talking about this comes to access and inclusion and also vulnerable communities. And maybe I'd like to go to you about this, Mihir. You're accessing communities. What type of considerations do you have to take for the most vulnerable communities to be accessed? Because that's the hardest. Sometimes you can talk about community financing, but there's a layer of vulnerability that's beyond the normal community as well. So in your work that you're doing in India, how is that what did you take into consideration for access and also inclusion of the most vulnerable?
I am very hesitant to say this to an academic audience here and the insurance people. But we decided all this criteria and indicators, and all this works and it's very good, but something needs to be tried out. And so we decided we'll select the first person, the first small business in Ahmedabad, all the care that we can take in the first town, not a small town, and then ask him or her to recommend somebody who he or she thinks is equally qualified to do that. And we've been able to do that in 11 cities, more than 3,000. This is my colleague who isn't here, Vishal, who would explain it far better, and my other colleague, Harak, who isn't here, who's a student from London School of Economics. I think will explain even better. But that has worked very well from various criteria to find somebody who is not appropriate to be part of that has really come up. So we just felt very, and it didn't cost us time, money, effort for the selection process that was there. What got included is a large number of small businesses who were started by the migrants, which is our greater concern. 67% are women-owned. Out of them, more than half of them single women running the family. There are 13% disabled, for example. So any way you try to measure, there are linguistic, then minorities, religious minorities, sexual orientation minorities, a whole range. So that's where the inclusion in terms of small businesses took place, more than 13 different sectors or types of small business. Food vendors and ready-made garments, etc., etc. And the last thing on inclusion is that it's not so well. It's equally important that who the project is able to include. But I think what's more lasting for us that we see is that what the people who are already there, they are able to include others on their own terms.
The referral system.
Exactly.
It's a bit like, if you refer someone, do you get a discount? I don't know how that happens now. But it's a referral system that you use to kind of identify who are the most vulnerable in the community. That's a really interesting way of getting that kind of societal. Like I know someone who's really in need, and you're going to refer them, as opposed to kind of putting down some criteria that you normally have and going through that process, right?
And the reason was that most of the criteria are generalized
Mm.
or universalized or are removed. They're supposed to be objective, and there is a value to that. But I think there is also disadvantage. So why not make value of something which is subjective, which is not very specific, not generalized, which is not standard, keeps on changing, and can we still make a difference? And the world is made of these things. That's actually.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll come back to another question later. Murtaza, maybe can you share a little bit about how the process of how is it that inclusion and action and inclusion and access to communities was looked at in the way you are working in the microfinance section in Pakistan and in the areas of most vulnerable areas you're working in?
Pakistan Macrofinance Network Macro Watch report, if you see, in this time we have 12 million active client in this Pakistan's because we have 13 macrofinance company and small 15 macrofinance institute and a national and our commercial bank also on working on the macrofinance initiatives. But the research report have 42 million potential client in Pakistan market. Because in our 70% people are living in rural areas, especially agriculture based. But all the stakeholder macrofinance companies, small, medium, and large, give to access the financial resources for their agriculture, livestock, and their small enterprises. But unluckily, previous 5 to 6 years, every years, flood, drought, and climate change affect their business, their crop, and their other things. They badly damages on these climate change. In this time, our government initiative for the subsidy for their insurance package, their crop, their livestock, their drought-based yield in these times. In our organization, I mean RCDP, we disperse 1.3 trillion PKR amount. If you see in US dollars, 432 million with the 2 million household, and our focused especially females, because our portfolio is a 98% portfolio with our females. Our 2 decade experience, females clients have very good discipline in repayment attitude. They can better manage their business. It is the very interesting. So we disperse in initial stages only 37 loan with the male community, and 37 clients are default. But now this times 99% is recovery rate with female clients, because they have very disciplines, they have very repayment discipline and repayment attitudes. And now we have very good package. If the people are living in under the poverty lines, RCDP and RCDP type other macrofinance company give him the assets as a grant. This grant is 100,000 PKRs. I mean, livestock asset. I mean, small business cottage. Give him to the after this. Our government initiate interest-free loans for females enterprises. This ticket size is 200,000. After this, our government new initiative, Prime Minister Youth Loan Programs for young females if they have the potential and they have the potential in microfinance. The government gave him to the 500,000 loan to the small enterprises. And now our chief ministers in Punjab, new initiatives, especially if the people have suffer from climate change, especially in our rural areas, in flood areas, if they are affected by the flood, our government, Punjab government, give him 1.5 million PKR for building the small house because they are flood in areas, their house are affected by the flood. Or now the government Punjab started their program, low cost housing program via by microfinance company at the amount of at the ticket size of 1.5 million PKR. So these initiatives are very supportive, but in the little bits we have not a specific agriculture policies. And information technology in especially in rural areas. If you see in our northern areas, the people are built and developed and started the initiative on agriculture and other small enterprises. Suddenly the climate change affects their crop and their yield, and their small enterprises, and then they lost their business and their crop. This is a big challenge in this time in Pakistan market, especially in northern areas, in rural areas, or in the desert areas, especially off-grid areas. They have many challenges because they little bit have the policy lack that the government policy, if have the policy that they give him the flexibility and insurance product, then they can stable and then they can run their business very safely.
Thanks, Murtada. That's really interesting to hear about the return rate of investment, your payment rates, and how default rates happen, and also the interesting fact that you give grants that are grants for those who are under the poverty line, and also for livelihood and livestock, especially who are climate impacted. Thanks so much for that. And I think maybe I'd like to go to either of you to look at what access and inclusion looks like in both your initiatives. If you can quickly highlight a bit of that, whichever works.
Okay, yeah. So I think education's an interesting one, and I think in a bit of a challenge to my colleagues in the broader humanitarian sector, I think we have to ask ourselves whose priorities are shaping financing decisions, because education is consistently identified by crisis-affected populations, communities, parents, teachers, community members as a priority. People care deeply about protecting learning during crisis. And yet only 2 to 4% of humanitarian funding goes to education. So if we say we're committed to accountability to affected populations, but communities repeatedly tell us education matters and we repeatedly don't fund it, we have to ask whether we're listening or not. And I think during COVID, of course, we also experienced firsthand what it means to have children's education disrupted. And many of us who had children at home worried about their learning, their well-being, their social interactions, and what their future opportunities would be. And we wanted our kids back in school as soon as possible, yet we expect families who are experiencing crisis to focus only on survival. And so obviously food and shelter and health are critical, but we overlook the fact that families want the future for their children, as we do as well. And so so we need to think about that. And the other difference between some of the types of well, the examples that we've got here, looking at profitable sectors like agriculture, that education is a global public good. So you're not having individuals pay for things like insurance. This is a global public good that we all need to pay for as society. And we need to think about ways in which we can invest in that to make it viable, because there won't be returns. At least they accrue to the individual and they accrue to society, but they don't they don't come in the same way that they do for farming or agriculture or energy or other sectors. So there is a difference. The other challenge we saw during the press, the pilot I talked about earlier, that we see impacts on education coming at different times than impacts on other things. So if you look at families who expect a drought to happen, you will take your kids out of school to cut back on expenses a long time before you are feeding your family less, or you're feeding your livestock less, or you're moving. No, you make these difficult choices. That can happen months before you see crop failure or livestock death, etc. And so some of the triggers that we have for prearranged finance are set at the wrong levels for education. And in order to come up with an insurance product that could work for schools in the 2 counties in Kenya, we had to go to a sample of around 40 schools, take the hard copy, 5 years worth of hard copy attendance data, digitize that, look at it against weather data, climate data, and try and find the correlation between what happened with weather events and when attendance dipped. Obviously, the trigger itself can be tied to attendance because you create perverse incentives, and parametric insurance is about this these objective triggers that can't be argued. So I mean, that was one of the challenges. But I think, sorry, 2 quick last points. Inclusion isn't just about who is reached. So obviously governments play a really important role, particularly in sectors like education. But there are those who are consistently left out of government provision. Often they are refugees, they are IDPs, they're communities in very fragile and remote areas. So local communities, but also international community has a role to play there. So I think the 2 key takeaways I have around inclusion are thinking about who gets reached, but also whose priorities are we addressing, and trying to make sure we cover both of those areas simultaneously and really what the humanitarian responses either at the local or the international level.
Thanks. That's really kind of referring a little to kind of the non-traditional ways of identifying who needs to be reached when, what timing, in a way, because you didn't even have the data available. It wasn't even digitized. It was like, we need to start from scratch and to try and correlate that to really a weather event and a trigger. That's not easy.
But it triggered at the right point, and we got the payout at the right point, and so it worked.
Yeah.
So we can expand it.
So perhaps, Caroline, what about the work you're doing, and how kind of looking at access, inclusion, how important is that in the work that in the countries that you're working in?
Absolutely paramount. So inclusion is the whole big idea. And I think one thing I always get, this is a personal thing, not to speak on behalf. I always get slightly excited when people say, oh, we have to include women. I thought, well, hang on, why would you exclude half the population? So I don't go from that to the premise women are by definition excluded. The trouble is though, actually they are. So if women aren't allowed bank accounts, if women aren't allowed to leave the house, they're excluded from formal financial system. There's no way you're going to get a cash payment from an insurance payout into her mobile wallet because she doesn't have a mobile phone. So I think let's not be naive about it, but it does grate every time I hear it. Having had that little rant, what we're doing at Humanitarian, if I could give you 2 examples of projects, which cover also things that my colleagues have mentioned before. So this idea of people will take children out of school well before they stop reducing the number of meals they eat and other in the longer term, slightly damaging practices. There was a very interesting project that we're supporting in Syria with the World Food Programme. So this is it's a partnership in the World Food Programme. It's a public-private partnership. So they're co-funded also by the World Bank's Global Shield Finance Facility. And this was a parametric drought trigger. The beauty of it is that the way it was set up, and again, I'm not an insurance person, so if anybody is, please feel free to correct me, but what didn't happen is that you had to wait till harvest day, walk outside and think, oh no, there are no crops, they're all dried up, nothing grew. So what happened was, Emma mentioned this vegetation index. So very early on, and then when it's all germinating underground, that's when you need quite a lot of rain. Sorry. So even at that stage, you know that there isn't as much rain as usual. It could be problematic. So you keep an eye on it for a couple of weeks. In this particular case, it's 20-day rolling window. That's quite clever in this particular case. Anyway, so if for those 40 days there still isn't enough rain, that's when you get the payout. So that's when WFP received $7.9 million, with which they were able to support 177,000 families. And the reason that was worth doing, I would say, was exactly because the harvest hasn't yet failed, but it's really looking pretty bad. Parametric insurance isn't there to prove whether or not nobody comes back 3 months later and said, no, but hang on, harvest wasn't too bad actually. After that conversation never happened. What happened was on day 39, day 40, I should say, the soil moisture and the vegetation index and all these various things were indicating that these were showing all the signs of drought. So all of those signs had been pre-agreed. The amount of $7.9 million had been pre-agreed. So what the World Food Programme, what they did was they distributed $100 to each of these 177,000 families precisely in time for them to carry on feeding themselves, to keep their children in school. I agree here. Cool. I mean, we all know what happens if you drop out of school and potential. So that was the idea of the World Food Programme. Also, just to prove that yes, it definitely can work. Education, even though that wasn't quite what we were focusing on, but it was a pleasant side. And briefly, if I may, another example: the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR's UN Refugee Agency in Malawi. You might think, well, that's not quite Syria, is it, in terms of being conflict affected? Indeed, it's not, thankfully. But at Dzaleka refugee settlement, everybody is there. All the refugees living in the settlement. In the land around Dzaleka, there are people who are living in fairly precarious situations already. And suddenly you've got hundreds of thousands of other people coming in who are also trying to live off the land and who are trying to, make the governments can find it quite difficult to support refugees. I'm sure we'll be able to confirm this in Pakistan with 1.4 million refugees. It can be very difficult, it can be very expensive, there can be all sorts of reasons you might not want to. The point being, UNHCR took out a parametric drought policy. But if there were a drought, there would be a payout to these refugees, and more to the point, also the host communities would receive a payout. The beauty of it was, and this is why this project is very exciting, it didn't pay, it didn't trigger. Not because the insurance didn't work, but because there was no drought. I mean, that has to be a good thing. That's the thing with insurance, you don't really want it to have to pay. If it has to pay, you want it to pay, but you don't want the bad thing to happen. That means it has to pay. What did happen though, was that alongside the parametric insurance, Humanitarian Insurance had provided some funding for resilience building activities, all to do with how to treat the land, done in rather clever ways to grow crops and woods. And the beauty of that was, lots of the refugees had been farmers before they were forced to flee their countries of origin. So what this did was actually build a rapport between the host communities and the refugees and prevented that sort of conflict that you can understandably quite often find when people are living on top of each other, resources are scarce, everyone's sort of fighting over the last scraps. And coming back to the inclusion point of view, I think that one could argue that forcibly displaced people are among the most vulnerable in the world. So I think I sort of hate to say this, but one of the clever things about insurance is that it's apolitical. So the insurance premium, you've agreed how much it's going to be. It doesn't care if that goes to a refugee. It doesn't care if it goes to a farmer or a headloader or the family of a child who's at risk of being losing her place at school. The money's there, and what we do at Humanitarian Insurance is just make sure that we're trusted partners. In this case, I'm talking about 2 UN agencies, other examples which are much more local. But I think that's the key, to make sure that you are reaching those vulnerable and that this is what those people have said we want to do.
And it's really interesting. I really like the point that you made about, even though there was no payout, the fact that there was a resilience building happening in addition or parallelly to anticipating a payout or not if the drought happened, was also building a community within and reducing conflict. So that conflict sensitivity piece that's integrated, seems like it's integrated, or maybe it was a byproduct of it.
No, deliberate.
Deliberate, there you are. So and that is something that's really important in looking at how we build some of these mechanisms to make sure that conflict sensitivity, adaptation, resilience building are part and parcel of some of these kind of work. So I think this particular one was really useful to share in that process, to say it's not just about the money, but it's about a lot of other things that come with a program that has a good design, right? And I think that's also crucial. I know we're a little on time, and maybe one quick round that I'd like to hear is on scale. Because we're talking about scaling locally led community, right? So we've heard about why we've started it out in a way. What were the gaps that we saw in typical practical communities not receiving funding because they were left behind, etc. Access, inclusion, to noting who are the most vulnerable in whatever way and form that we found out how and who they were is interesting to hear from different speakers. But now, what is the scalability of this sort of project that you're doing? And I think I'm going to quickly go to you first, Mihir. In terms of, you've already now expanded it to 11 cities. That's already great, from Ahmedabad to 11. What are your thoughts on this scalability? We always look at business proof, the proof of evidence, which is always what donors ask for, private sector asks for. We want to make sure it's, the return of investment, ROI, all the buzzwords. What's the buzzword here?
Well, there is no buzzword, but there are two things which is really facing us in our work, and I'm sure Carolyn as well. One is that whatever experience we have, it's common public good. How do we make the most of it in terms of influencing policies, with the National Disaster Management Authority really encouraging them to have hopefully universal coverage of disaster-affected people through insurance coverage, if that's possible. And that dialogue is going on. There are a series of other development funds for small businesses, medium enterprise, etc., etc. So how do those funds, which are public welfare funds, reach, and they are combined with this? That's second in terms of scale. Third is in terms of how the capital formation at the small business level happens faster and better. And that's the third thing that we are looking at. Also is to look at third-party evaluations of how the programs are performing, because insurance programs of private businesses don't really get evaluated as a third party, and there isn't much data that we know of. So that's just and not only evaluate from the business point of view, but evaluated from the people who received either money or premium, kind of a report card of insured. And that's something that we don't see. So that's a part one. Part two is much larger in terms of globally. And one thing we've seen is that there are hardly any demand studies done in terms of insurance. That what is it that people actually want? It's very supply driven. And because insurance companies are big, they are rich, they are very accurate, they have the data for years and centuries, perhaps in some cases. and which is true and which should be taken with respect. But there is something important in terms of demand. And we've seen variety of demand surveys that my colleague who's in here, Mehul Pandya, has started, and really get very interesting insights. So that's one. Second, most of the upscaling is always thought in terms of numbers. And what we are pushing for is the period, 10 years, 15 years, maybe 2,000, maybe 20,000, but 10 years can we do that? Then only we will get a real picture what happens over a period of time. That's also scale. Scale is not. So that is second. And third and last, I end with that, is that parametric insurance or insurance per se is not going to stand beyond a certain height if it's not buttressed with livelihoods on the one hand and health on the other. And that's something, so the idea that if I may do it here at top of my head, the humanity insured also is humanity which has work, employed, humanity employed, and it's also humanity which is healthy. So when humanity is healthy and insured and has work, they are insured better going to and educated. Educated. Absolutely.
Humanity, healthy, educated, insured, and we had one more. Sorry, working. Wow, that's great.
If we have to rename humanity insured, that's a good
That's long one, right? Yeah.
That's what happens when you're at LSE. Lots of new ideas come, and the world changes. Cooperative movement started here. So
yeah. Thanks. Very interesting on what you mentioned. Scale can look very different for very different options, and for you and the work you're doing, you're seeing scale as not just about scaling to multiple cities, but also scaling in terms of years, because and that's really right, because right now we are already seeing impacts of climate change, heat waves, cyclones. We're expecting a super El Nino coming up, and this is going to be the new norm. It's going to be more often a super El Nino than rarely a super El Nino, right? So if that's the case, the 10 to 20 years scaling of the years is really important, because this is going to recur more often and more frequently. And that's, I think, maybe something to think about. Scale for you.
So very quickly, just to pick up on Mihu's point, I think it can be challenging when we talk to humanitarian actors about insurance, because people think this is about insurance companies getting rich. I think we need to change this talk to more one of financial inclusion. If a climate event happens to my house in Glasgow, it's insured. It's challenging, but it will be rebuilt. If I'm a farmer in Turkana, my whole herd is wiped out, I have no insurance, I have no cover, my life, my financial future is ruined. And so it is about that financial inclusion piece. I think it's really important that we mention that. For the education specific example for CREST, it proved that pre-arranged finance can work. It can help protect education during shocks, but it's not something that we can go actor by actor, NGO by NGO, donor by donor, and try and build the patchwork. We need to do it together. Government is critical. So in education systems, obviously, mostly are delivered by governments themselves. We're already seeing in Kenya, we had a major win in that education is now included in their new disaster risk finance strategy from 2026 to 2030. It's only the second place in the world after the Philippines that includes education in their DRF strategy. So that's exciting. But we need to think about how we can build on the whole range of actors that work in this education space. So community knowledge of local priorities and realities are important. Local organizations are critical for their relationships, their trust, and their implementation capability. INGOs can help bring convening and bring technical capacities. Insurers and risk pools understand risk and can price risk and model that risk transfer. And development banks, donors can provide large-scale finance, and philanthropies can take risks that others can't. So the challenge is bringing everyone together in a common process. And we're working with a number of other NGOs to think about how we can develop an education risk financing platform where you bring together pre-arranged finance, capital, and risk transfer within a shared structure. which could be really important. We're also on the sovereign side supporting governments to think about how we can include education in the Global Shield Financing Facility and potentially carve out an education window there. I think one of the things, as we're talking about scale and as we're talking about local community and local actors, that's really important to remember though, is that we need to make sure that financing tools are available to local organisations. So we don't risk having a future where innovative finance is only available to really specialised, really large INGOs or other actors with specialised expertise. And so if we really want to see this type of financing scale, I think there's three core things we need to have. And the proof of that will be when we make sure that communities have access to finance in advance of a crisis, when we make sure that local actors can participate meaningfully in that. And from my perspective, when we can make sure that education, schools and children are protected to continue learning during the crisis.
Okay, I don't have to do any wrapping up of that. Murtaza, I'm going to quickly ask you, and we're a little short on time. We want to make sure everyone has some chance to ask questions. What is the scaling option for you in the work you're doing for community financing in rural areas in Pakistan?
Pakistan, the fifth largest populated country and seventh business potential country globally, because we have 64% our youth, male and females. We have a very rich potential for entrepreneurs. And now we designs the mechanisms that we have the public-private partnership, we have the public partnership, and we have the partnership with the Punjab government. We have the partnership with the Prime Minister interest-free loan. We have the partnership with the central bank. We have the partnership with the 6 international investors. I mean, in this time, our 6 active international investors, including Blue Orchard, Triple Jump, and EQ and DWM. And we are also working with the Asian Development Bank and World Bank through PPF, Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund, because we have the agency models with the small microfinance unit. Those are working on the district level. RCDP deploy their fund in those institute on the agency model. These small institute, first of all, they develop the linkages with the line department. I mean, agriculture department, livestock department, and other training department. Those are linkages with the line department, I mean government department. These communities and these small microfinance institute are the bridge between government and the community. The community capacitate with these small institute, and RCDP give him to the financial and non-financial services, because not only financial services fulfill the gap of their need of their livelihood. If we give him the non-financial services, I mean the product development, I mean some marketing skill, financial literacy rate, financial literacy, and financial inclusion, especially workforce of the females. We focused on the females, and we have in this time 5 years our business plans, not in our province, but we expand the program in other province. I mean Sindh, KPK, Gilgit-Baltistan, Kashmir, and the Balochistan. We have the others 5-year business plans, and we have in our pipelines. I already discussed with you domestic and international investor, and we have the target to 1.5 million females, especially those females based in urban, semi-urban, and rural area based communities. And we also negotiate with our government for the insurance product, especially when the climate change affects their product, especially in the livelihood and in agriculture. So if we success to facilitate him via our government special product insurance, then we can do this stable to the community in rural areas, especially female, our client.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. You also mentioned scaling it to youth, to different areas of activities, and also the partnerships are important to make sure that the scaling happens in different contexts. And I think you also mentioned that you're working with NGOs in some of the harder areas to reach, who are in partial conflict like Kashmir, etc. So that's also an interesting model to look at of the public-private, civil society, NGO partnerships. Thanks a lot. I'm going to go to you, Carolyn. Kate.
Gail,
Yeah.
thank you. I have 1 minute. This is very, so I think, Emma, you hit the nail on the head when you said that local access was meaningful. So I'm just going to quote you and let that sink in. Anyway, the idea was, so we went to Togo in 2024 in West Africa to nominate. There, Lotto 1 had heard of parametric insurance and thought that sounds like an excellent idea. We get flooded all the time. Wasn't quite sure what it was, how much it cost, how to go about it, all the rest of it. So I went along with some colleagues from Accelerator, which is an insurance company not insuring this particular project. I need to be clear on that, but they do all the modelling and structuring and all the sort of insurance side of it. So we spent 2 weeks in Togo in 2024 talking to the mayors, 3 communes who were interested, talking to their technical teams, talking to the head of the motorbike taxi syndicate, talking to the teachers, the nurses, talking to the people who help with market trade, all of these people. And the questions, nothing to do with insurance, no one cares about insurance. The questions were, what happens to you when it floods? What needs to happen when it floods? Lots of people were saying the water hangs around and you get mosquitoes, this, that, and the other. So, okay, so you're talking about pumping water out very quickly. Other people would say, no, it's when it comes rushing down the hill, because that's when it goes straight through the spool and everything gets washed away and then the water stays there. So the point of that is to say that we spent those 2 weeks. There was a brief explanation of parametric insurance and how it works. That wasn't really the point. The point was to listen to what these people were saying. Why on earth, and I'm hark back if I may a little bit to exclusion inclusion, without a premium subsidy, the mayors of those communes wouldn't have been able to afford it. The idea is that it pays frequently. Because this is new, insurance has to sort of prove its worth in this particular project by paying, which it has done. Twice in Quarter 1 and once in Gulf 1, so 2 of 3. Now there are 4 more communes who are very excited about it. The mayor of Pekin in Senegal also got excited. So last year we went to Pekin to talk to him. We didn't have insurance now. It sounds rather flippant, but the point is there. Had we not spent 2 weeks asking people what it was they wanted, there's no way you can draw up a meaningful contingency. So there's no point having insurance, frankly. You get £100 million in payouts. I'm making that one up. You could do, but I don't know how you do it. Anyway, you've got your £100 million. No one's quite sure what to do with it. So 6 months later, people are still fiddling around arguing over it should go to education. Somebody else says, no, it shouldn't. Maybe they don't. It takes a long time to agree these things. But I think that the really important and very exciting part of that project is that we didn't even talk about co-design. I don't know how to design an insurance product. I've never lived in Togo. I don't know what happens when it floods. So I'm not co-designing anything with anybody. All I'm doing is listening and taking notes of what people say, passing that to people who can model and structure an insurance product, leaving them to do their work to make this insurance do what the chairman of the motorbike association said he wanted it, what that teacher told us went wrong with it at school. In terms of scale, well over a minute. In terms of scale, already it's expanded to Senegal. Already we're looking at 4 additional communes. Already other donors are looking at this project with interest, because, and even potentially the government the government of Togo is considering setting up its own national premium subsidy fund. So just for the communes that are worst affected by flood. That's another story. It's a bit of a long one. But yes, scale is possible. But it comes back to what you said. If you don't listen in the first place, you're trying to sell somebody something. Nobody wants to be sold something. They really don't. If you listen to what people are saying, then you can actually create something that they need and that they want. Yeah. And that's where the interest comes.
And this is exactly what even Mihir mentioned, right? Like scale piece has to work with what communities need. And it's not always the same model, and it's very contextual as well. So with this, I'm going to open it up for questions because we don't have so much time, but actually to be able to field some questions. I already see some hands up. Anyone else? Okay, I saw you first, so I'm going to catch you first. Please introduce yourself and ask the question. And for those online, I'd also like to ask you to put in the chat any questions, and we'll pick it up from here. Second, third, fourth. Maybe one online. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Esteban. I'm a MSc student at Imperial College doing environmental technology and policy. And I have a background on climate policy. In my previous job, we used to do some things around like disaster recovery work, and it was framed in how it's called like just recovery, in the same way that it's called just transition, just a just recovery. And I think I might have gone a bit lost on how you explained premiums and like the financing, because I don't know this very well, but like I like the aspect of like social transformation that's like localized and context specific, and I thought that was really great. But what I got lost was on hearing about long-term resilience and like risk reduction. How do like insurance comes into play with that, in terms of, if we know that like droughts are getting worse, floods are getting worse, how do the communities like build that adaptation instead of like the payouts are like, I understand like at the moment that's what you need, is that like that mitigates risk.
We'll come to that. Great. We get your question, but we'll actually go around for that response.
Yeah, hi, my name is Thomas. I'm with Oxfam as climate justice advisor. I have a question on perhaps for Humanity Insured, and that's, you mentioned a lot of indicators around climate and climate-induced disasters. And we as Oxfam, we have quite a lot of experience with global parametrics and also climate-related insurance schemes. And internally, I've been discussing also conflict-related triggers and conflict-related humanitarian responses are often either due to climate change or the conflict. So, but there's a lot of discussion going on around the perverse incentives that you also just mentioned. So I was wondering whether you've had any experience or any thinking about that. That would be interesting. And I also had a question on the premiums. You mentioned premium subsidies taking place. I wonder if you have some examples where communities start paying in as well, and what sort of levels are we then talking?
Yeah, great. Hello, my name is Daphne Jayasinger, and I'm also from the International Rescue Committee. So really interested to hear everybody on the panel, and huge fan of the press work. What I wanted to ask is for all of the panel, whether you experience frustrations or limitations in the financing system in support of some of these innovations. And I ask that because you mentioned Global Shield, you mentioned financial inclusion, you mentioned education, you mentioned a number of themes that often get caught between humanitarian development and finance, and climate. And one major obstacle to scaling a lot of these initiatives, and to your point, Emma, to prioritizing the needs as people themselves identify them, is the way in which the rest of the sector defines humanitarian, which is something that is financed after an event. And so this is the opposite of that, what you're describing, and much of what you're all describing is resilience sort of ahead of a shock, building resilience ahead of a shock, not life-saving after an event. So yeah, I'd be interested in whatever that sort of frustration or barrier or challenge is from all of your perspectives at the systemic level.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Amay. I'm also from the IRC. I work in climate research and innovation, so there's a sizable IRC contingent. Question for you. I'm really sorry. I'm terrible. Caroline, and it's around risk tolerance. You mentioned the idea of insurance proving its worth, and while that's certainly a very necessary step at the community side, what sort of work do you do in improving the risk tolerance of your private insurance firms who make investments in your projects?
Anyone from online? No questions at the moment? Okay, let's maybe do a round. On the question of looking at resilience building, adaptation instead of, and not just only, start with you, go.
Yeah. So actually, this comes to Daphne's question as well. Look, insurance is just a tool. It is one of many things that you need. It is not the only response. And in fact, it really should be the last layer of response in a wider risk-layered program. So really what you're doing, if you face a risk, just like if you faced a challenge at home, first of all, you use the money that you've got in your current account. Then you use your savings account. Then potentially you use your credit card. Then if you have to, you use insurance. It works exactly the same way for governments. They will have their own budgets. They'll have contingency funds. They'll have access to credit, normally if it's prearranged. And then you have insurance for those big events that you can't cover with those earlier layers. So although I think we've all focused on insurance because there's interest in that as a sort of a new thing, there's a lot that you have to do before that stage. So in the CREST programme, we worked with communities and schools to say, what steps are you going to take before the insurance kicks in? Because it might not kick in. What do you do yourselves to adapt? How do you make the schools themselves more resilient to heat, to drought, to floods? What do you do in the first instance? Because it will only trigger when it reaches an attachment point, i.e. a certain level when the insurance comes in. So the insurance alone is not enough, and I think we have to stress that. But it is important that we're starting to think about ways, the key points around prearranged finance, whether it's insurance or any other type of prearranged finance, is that you have three core things in place. You know where the finance is coming from, you know what it's going to be, how it's going to be delivered, and you know what it's going to be spent on. And those three things together should help you deliver a more effective response earlier, and on things that you've already decided. You're not arguing in the heat of the moment. You've already decided what matters. So I think those points are critical.
I'm going to you because you've been looking at not just the insurance piece, but also the resilience piece of those communities, right? So perhaps you can share a little bit on that.
Two things are very important. Going slightly above the insurance program project per se, that's what we are doing. One is the way I see our work, it's very local, but also very global work that Carolyn is doing and your work, is that the whole process is to democratize insurance products and processes. And they are not really democratic, even within. How do you do that? And that's something very troublesome. And by that, let me give me two concrete examples. One is, as soon as you talk about insurance, it has to be a company, a corporate entity, and so on and so forth. And not really. I mean, there are cooperatives of insurance. And why not more of those than companies alone? And there are insurance facilities, and why not more of those? Oxfam can encourage this idea further. Why not unions of kind of insurance and do that? So I think the institutional structure through which we want to deliver resilience, that there is a bit lack of imagination, creativity, perhaps. And that's something addressing three of your questions simultaneously. And the second part is, because we are at LSE, is about how do you study risk and resilience differently? And one doesn't see much of that. One sees that happening on the ground among the people who are affected and among the people who are practicing. But in terms of academics and so, for example, there would be market studies about insurance, parametric or other, but not demand study, as I said. How do you observe insurance impact differently than if they have been done so far? How do you observe ROI differently, and not only from a community point of view, which is very important, and I've made a point and you've made a point, but are there other ways of doing it? So, in short, I think we are a bit glum group and need to be more creative and hopeful about things.
Do you want to field one or two of those questions? I think they're quite related to you, especially on the conflict piece.
Sure. Yes.
And we'll come to end also on that, but not on insurance, but on other things. Yes, there's time.
Okay.
We will make the time.
If I may also just maybe address, I really didn't come here to say this, but anyway, this question of democratizing insurance. If I can mention Togo again, if we're sort of now happy and we know where we are in Togo. So the idea was that for the mayors, so they had designed that, they knew what they wanted the insurance to do and how it would work and all the rest of it. And we said, well, you can either get insured in London, or there's a Togolese insurance company. It's more expensive. They said, well, that doesn't matter. No, we want Togolese. They got Togolese because that really mattered. The idea is that the capacity of that Togolese company, still a company, admittedly not a cooperative, but they're finding out more about parametric insurance, which means that next time you don't need to send AXA to Togo because they can explain it themselves. They can look at marketing to different communities. Just aware the time is a bit short. Ishkan, that was a very interesting question about disaster risk reduction and adaptation. Togo, again, such a good example. So when it paid, it was triggered and part of the contingency plan was if one of the weather stations triggered, they would get 25 million across the ever. And in the plan was to build a drainage channel just under the market, just above, I'm going to say it, just above a school and a church, both very important institutions in the community. The idea was that the market traders, their produce was being washed away, no one would come to the market or the rest of it. So the thing is, next time it rains, it won't flood. So that's sort of for that particular market. I appreciate it's one market in one commune in the whole of Togo, which is one country in the whole country. It could go on. But that's already insurance paying for adaptation measures. There'll be purists who say that's an incredibly expensive way to go about it. And I would tend to agree. But if it's subsidized, the insurance, that's exactly what the commune needed, exactly what people said. That's why the contingency plan specified we would need this drainage channel. When I went a couple of months ago just to see what was going on with this rather beautiful drainage channel, asked people in the market, what's all this about? No one had ever heard of insurance. No one had ever, nor should they, have heard of Humanitarian insurance. Nobody knew where the money had come from, but they loved the drainage channel. They thought their mayor was rather brilliant to have built this drainage channel. That's what matters. It's not whether, it doesn't matter to Florence, who was selling her avocados. She doesn't care. What does she care? But the fact is the drainage channel is there. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. When I mentioned about, that's a bit of a dicey point about insurance proving its worth, I think absolutely it's a very good point because insurers are there to make profit. In the same way I could point out that humanitarian organisations do, on the whole, pay their electricity bills, their gas bills, those are all profit-making enterprises. not even in the insurance industry. The point being, the sorts of projects that Humanity Insured is doing, it doesn't even touch the sides. If you think that 5% of climate-related loss, as it were, in Africa is insured, 5%, it's not even touching the side of a North American hurricane season. That one's billions and billions. This one's barely a million. The idea is much more to get this started. And frankly, to be equitable. If I'm able, I may not want to, but I have the right, if you like, to insure my car. Why on earth should this, just because the person can't insure can't afford the premium subsidy, why should this be, are they not allowed it? They don't merit it somehow? There's that sort of inequity there. And I think because Humanity Insured is very new, we can be a little bit more adventurous in terms of perhaps insurance that a typical insurer would say, 1 in 3 years, that's not insurance. Normally it would be 1 in 10, 1 in 50, 1 in 100. But that's no good to somebody who needs a drainage channel. They need it. They need the payments very, very quickly.
And just so on time, we'll come back to you on one more. And maybe I need to go to you, Ed. Ed,
yeah.
Just because, so Ed is with DEC, Disasters Emergency Committee, and they've really been like so supportive for us to actually have this session going on with all the background work that you've done. So thank you so much to Ed team, Francis, who's here. You're working on looking at financing your members and integrating that mainstreaming climate environment into conflict, and a little bit on the conflict. It's not exactly parametric insurance, but how do we ensure that climate and environmental action is happening in emergency response, which is the hardest? So over to you.
Thank you, Nishani, and thank you, panelists. Really interesting to hear. I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, because I recognise I've overrun slightly. I think half the room works for a DC member, a bit over half. The DC brings together 15 international NGOs and launched a public raising money for humanitarian crises outside of the UK. Our members include Save the Children, Oxfam, British Red Cross, and others. We've been around since the 1960s, and we've launched almost 80 appeals responding to conflicts, to disasters, and to health crises, raising 2.5 billion at the time. But we're more than just a fundraiser, we're also a convener, and we bring together our members to address shared challenges, learning and improvement. Since 2024, the Climate and Environment Charter, being a signatory to the Climate and Environment Charter, has been a membership requirement for the DEC. It's also attached to our current strategy. So we are working with our members collectively to adopt the commitments of the Charter. And for this, we've held a series of workshops. We've also adapted our reporting so that members can report to us on their performance. And we regularly draft syntheses to report back on that to the membership, but also the wider sector from the newsletter of the Climate Environment Charter. And I think that the examples that we're capturing and what we're seeing in our current appeals in Myanmar, but also in the Middle East Humanitarian Appeal that covers Palestine and Lebanon, shows that even in fragile, conflict-affected settings, climate adaptation and environmental sustainability can still be built right from the get-go. I think it's time, I'll just highlight a few examples from recent reporting rounds. So for commitment 1 in the Charter, stepping up our response to the climate crisis. In Myanmar, members are working with communities to identify risks and develop action plans covering things like flooding, heat waves, seasonal monsoon, soil degradation. In Myanmar, members are working on climate smart agriculture, responding to climate related vulnerabilities, supporting livelihood recovery in a way that reduces the environmental harm of farming, but also builds resilience to future shocks. Some examples against Commitment 1, against Commitment 2, some examples from the Middle East appeal. In Lebanon, members are using solar power to rehabilitate water networks and pumping systems, reducing dependency on fuel, and also supporting long-term stability. Another one would be waste management in Gaza. Members are working on sewage pumping, building longer listing latrines and emergency septic tanks, preventing contamination and protecting the groundwater. I'll stop there in terms of examples. I had more, but in the interest of time, I think what these examples show is that even in incredibly constrained environments like Gaza, like Myanmar, where you've got political considerations, access considerations, programming to support climate adaptation and environmental sustainability can still happen despite those constraints. It also complements other reform agendas that the DEC is very passionate about, namely localization. So we're really keen to support this practice, we're keen to support learning, but we recognise that collective action is needed and no one DEC member or no one agency can do this alone. It's something that we need to take together. And that's why the DEC is working with members, partners, Climate Environment Charter and the wider sector to address these challenges. So I just wanted to highlight that very quickly. A lot of information, but back to you, Michelle.
Absolutely pertinent, and I'm sure you have a bit more of the conversations that you might want to with Caroline. Noting time, thanks for staying a little over. I know there's some drinks happening, refreshments are outside. Murtaza, thank you for being online. I'm sorry you're not here in person. I think we'll wrap up for the moment, though I think this conversation can merits another half an hour of a discussion likely. But this is one of the conversations we will host and we will continue to do so more. Please don't hesitate to look at our website and sign up to the newsletters to keep updated. We're here to share lessons learned from the ground, what's happening at community level, how communities are already preparing themselves resilient to climate shock, and how organizations within our network of the Charter, the DEC, and their partners like Humanitarian are actually moving these pieces forward. And we are really looking to see how can we scale this up more? How can that sort of, alternative financing from philanthropies, from private sector, from insurance companies, how does this kind of, and donors, of course, we do want the donors to come in to kind of have some of that base funding, the grants that are required to kind of blend finance together, which is something we've seen quite a lot of organizations doing, is to improve that. So we're here to kind of share some of these lessons learned, say it's already happening on the ground. It's not new. Proof of business is here. The evidence is there. It's clear. Talk to the communities. The communities are there, already have lessons learned, already have solutions. We just need to make sure we're hearing them and we're actually working with them to build these systems and put them in place to make sure we're helping them to be more resilient for now climate shocks and for future climate shocks. So thanks everyone for being here in person, even during a heat wave. And please don't hesitate to come and talk to the speakers and ask them for more questions. Thanks so much, Siri, for managing everything and for all the support. Thanks to Jack, thanks to LSC, thanks to, of course, we have had Innocence doing all the background work for us. Thank you so much. And for helping us with the tech as well, and setting this up in this beautiful room that we're privileged to be at LSC. Thanks for everyone online. Thanks for the
Thank you.